Ever get that feeling when you're looking up at the stars, like just this incredible sense of wonder and maybe, just maybe, a little bit of loneliness too? We are diving deep into that feeling today. The Fermi paradox, that puzzle of why we haven't found any aliens yet.
It's a big universe out there.
It really is. And we're tackling this with a really interesting twist today. Our source material proposes this mind-blowing idea. What if the key to evolving intelligent life, like us, isn't about being perfect, but actually about being perfectly, well, imperfect?
It is a fascinating twist. We tend to think about death as being, well, the end, right? But what if it's actually the key? What if that's the spark that got the whole thing going, that led to intelligence evolving here on Earth?
It really makes you rethink everything, doesn't it? Life, the universe, everything. But let's take a step back for a second for anyone who might be new to this whole thing. Let's start with the Fermi paradox itself. What are we talking about when we say Fermi paradox?
Well, it basically points out this really interesting inconsistency in the universe, right? Think about it. The universe is billions of years old. Billions. And it's full of planets, tons of them that could potentially support life. So, statistically speaking, shouldn't we have found something by now? Some sign of another civilization out there?
You'd think so, with all those stars and planets.
Exactly. But so far, nothing. And that's where the great filter theory comes in. It tries to explain this by proposing that there's a hurdle somewhere, a barrier that prevents most life from reaching those super advanced intelligence stages.
A cosmic roadblock of sorts.
Oh, wait, yes.
And what our source today suggests is that this filter, this roadblock, it might actually be happening way earlier than we think. And not with a bang like we often imagine, not a giant asteroid wiping everything out, but with a whimper, with something as fundamental as immortality actually keeping the universe eerily quiet.
It really challenges how we think about life, doesn't it? This idea that maybe the natural order of things, the default, isn't actually mortality, but endless existence.
Immortality. But if that's the case, why do we see death all around us, everywhere in nature?
Well, to get that, we need to zoom in, go microscopic, and look at what's happening at the cellular level, at the very code of life itself, our DNA.
Okay, so DNA, break that down for me. How does that all fit in here?
All right, think about how cells divide. Every time a cell divides, it needs to make a copy of its DNA, right?
Makes sense.
But there's this interesting quirk. At the ends of our chromosomes, there's this little issue. We call it the end replication problem. It's basically that the very tips of our DNA strands, these things called telomeres, they get a bit shorter with each division.
It's like our DNA has these tiny little caps that wear down over time.
A good way to put it, imagine them like those little plastic tips on your shoelaces, the ones that stop them from fraying. Eventually, those telomeres, they get too short, the cell can't divide properly anymore, and what happens? Aging, and eventually, well, death.
So it's like a built-in biological clock, constantly ticking away. I get it. But where does immortality come into this whole picture? Lost me a bit there.
Okay, so imagine, just for a moment, that DNA replication was absolutely flawless, perfect. No end replication problem, no telomere shortening. In that scenario, cells could theoretically just keep dividing forever. They'd achieve essentially immortality, at least at the cellular level.
That's kind of amazing, but also a bit scary when you really think about it. But if that were possible, wouldn't the universe be completely overrun with these immortal organisms?
And that right there, that's the crux of this whole hypothesis. See, as cool as immortality might seem, it actually presents some big, big challenges, especially when we're talking about complex life evolving.
Okay, I'm with you so far, I think. But how does immortality actually get in the way of complex life developing? Help me make that connection.
All right, picture this. You have a planet, and it's teeming with life, simple, single-celled organisms, all of them immortal. What happens?
I'm guessing if they're not dying, they're just going to keep multiplying, right?
Exactly. And that right there is where the problems start.
Okay, so we're picturing a whole planet full of these immortal single-celled organisms, and they're just multiplying like crazy. What could possibly go wrong in that scenario? I mean, it's life, right?
Think about it. Even just one bacterium dividing into 2, then 4, then 8, and on forever. What happens? Well, you get this exponential growth, just an explosion of life, and that would use up the planet's resources incredibly fast.
So it's like a cosmic case of bacteria eating their way through the universe. They'd run out of food eventually.
They would, but it's bigger than just space and food. I mean, these organisms, they'd be producing waste, changing their environment as they go, and that whole ecosystem would be pushed to its absolute limit. And with no death, no natural cycle of renewal, that planet, it would be stuck, just stuck in this state of being totally overcrowded, completely stagnant.
Yeah, that doesn't sound like a very nice place to live, never mind evolve.
Exactly. And this is where things get really interesting, I think. This is where we get to the heart of why this whole thing matters. Because, see, evolution, it needs variation to work. Death, it creates the space for new generations to come along, generations with these little differences in their traits. Some of those differences, they might be beneficial, might make an organism better suited to the environment. That's how natural selection works. Right?
Survival of the fittest. The ones that fit best, they thrive, and the ones that don't, well, they die off, making room for the others.
You got it. But now imagine if nothing ever dies. That whole process, it just stops. You hit the pause button on evolution.
So in a weird way, death is what pushes things forward, what allows for more complexity, more diversity, more life as we know it, really. Kind of counterintuitive, isn't it?
Totally. And to really wrap our heads around it, I think it helps to bring it down to earth, to look at some real-world examples of what happens when growth just goes unchecked.
So let's get down to earth, literally. What kind of examples are we talking about here?
Have you ever heard of algal blooms?
You mean those massive green swirls you see in lakes and oceans sometimes?
Those are the ones.
What causes those? I've always wondered.
So algal blooms happen when algae, which are single-celled organisms, just like we've been talking about, when they reproduce super fast, it's usually because there's a ton of nutrients in the water, often because of stuff we're doing, human activities.
So it's like their environment suddenly becomes this giant all-you-can-eat buffet, and they just lose control.
Basically. And because they're growing so fast, they end up sucking up all the oxygen in the water, which of course suffocates other marine life. And to make things even worse, they can release toxins that hurt fish and just mess up the entire ecosystem.
A good reminder that even these tiny little organisms can have a huge impact when things get out of balance.
Totally. And it's not just happening in the water. There's another really fascinating example from the animal kingdom this time. Have you ever heard of Turritopsis dohrnii?
Can't say that I have.
It's also known as the immortal jellyfish.
Immortal jellyfish. I need to get me one of those. But seriously, how does a jellyfish become immortal?
Well, I should clarify, it's not actually immortal in the way we've been talking about, like forever and ever, but it has this amazing ability, see, to revert back to an earlier stage in its life cycle when it's stressed out or injured.
So it's like the Benjamin Button of the sea. Instead of aging, it gets younger.
Exactly. When things get tough, it basically transforms itself back into a polyp, a much simpler form. And from there, it can start its life all over again.
Wow. That is amazing. That's incredible that something like that even exists in nature. But even with this, like immortality light, there's got to be a downside, right? Nothing's perfect.
You're right, there is. As amazing as it seems, this ability to kind of cheat death, it means that the immortal jellyfish can, under the right conditions, multiply like crazy. And remember what we talked about with the algal blooms? Too many of them, and it throws everything out of whack. Same thing here, they end up competing with other species for food and resources, and the whole ecosystem can get messed up.
So there's a pattern emerging here, isn't there? It seems like nature is trying to tell us something. Whether it's single-celled organisms or immortal jellyfish, balance is key. Too much of anything, even a good thing, can have some really unexpected consequences. And death, well, it seems like death plays a vital role in keeping things in check.
Absolutely. Death, mortality, these things that we tend to see as negatives, they're actually crucial for the whole system to work. They drive evolution and they shape the incredible diversity of life that we see all around us.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. From the mind-boggling scale of the universe to a jellyfish that can basically just rewind its life. And all of this to try and understand why, we haven't bumped into any other life forms out there in the cosmos.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? And what I find so fascinating about this whole immortality idea is that it changes how we see the great filter, that barrier we've been talking about. It's not necessarily some big, dramatic event that wipes out advanced civilizations, but maybe it's something much more fundamental, something embedded in how life begins.
So instead of a dead end on the road to intelligence, it's more like a detour sign right at the beginning, one that most planets just seem to naturally follow. So are you saying this immortality thing, this roadblock, it's what keeps life from ever reaching that intelligent stage on other planets?
It's a real possibility. Think about it. The universe could be absolutely teeming with life, planets covered in these simple, immortal organisms, beautiful in its own way, but stuck. Without death, without that evolutionary push, intelligence might just be completely out of reach for them.
That's a pretty humbling thought, isn't it? That our very existence, the fact that we can even ask these questions, might come down to a series of unlikely events, starting with, well, the ability to die, makes you wonder, what if we are the exception, not the rule? What if we're it?
Big questions, no easy answers, but it does highlight just how precious life on Earth really is. All the things we often see as limitations, death, mutations, even that constant struggle for survival, those might be the keys, the things that unlocked everything for us, that allowed for complexity, intelligence, consciousness.
It reminds me of that Alan Watts quote, something like, the only way to make sense out of change is to plunge into it, move with it, and join the dance. Sounds like life is that dance. And death, well, death is just part of the choreography.
Beautiful way to put it. And it leads us to the question we want to leave you with today. If we are alone in this vast universe, what does that mean for us? What's our purpose then? How does that change how we view our responsibility to our planet, to each other, to ourselves? Something to think about the next time you look up at all those stars.
We hope you enjoyed this deep dive. It's a strange, beautiful, and mysterious universe out there. And as always, there's so much more to explore.